If you like the content and willing to support my effort, then please subscribe to my channel, give it a like and share it with everyone. Thank you. Hi everyone, hope all of you are doing well. So today we're going to look at a famous game from the history of chess. I have received many requests to do a video on this game. As you already have seen in the title, it is the only game that has been played between Mikhail Tal and Viswanathan Anand. The game is from the tournament named as the Tournament of Generations, or Tournoi de Generation in French, if you may call it, organized in the city of Cannes in France. In this tournament, all the games are played between one player representing the newer generation of chess players and other player representing the older generation. So one side has just started exploring the world. They are full of fresh ideas and energy. On the other hand, the other side has seen the ultimate success in their life and they are full of experience and knowledge. This game was played in the year of 1989 and it was the month of February. So Tal was 52 years old and Anand is 19 years old. Tal was obviously not at his best form. It was only 3 years before his death and he was already suffering from a number of serious health issues, which also reflects in this game. It was not the traditional Tal style which we are used to see in his games. On the other hand, Anand is in the way of becoming a legend, and as they say, morning shows the day. The fact is absolutely evident in this game. He played in the way someone should play when they are facing a player like Mikhail Tal. So without further delay, let us dive into the game. We are just here to enjoy the game between the magician of chess and the lightning kid. So Tal is playing with the white pieces and Anand is playing with the black pieces. Tal begins the game with c4, the English opening, and Anand replies with c5, the symmetrical variation. We are looking at knight f3 taking control of the center, knight c6 by black, and knight c3, the two-knight variation of the English opening. And on the next move, Anand goes for knight d4. Now, moving the same piece twice in the opening is against the traditional rules of openings, but there is a reason behind playing this kind of move. If you think about it, then this knight is the only piece of white that is currently defending the dark squares of the center. Now black is planning to remove this knight of the board so that white's control over these dark squares become weak, and then he can manipulate the situation accordingly. Suppose here knight captures knight after c into d4, white's control over the dark squares of the center, which is the d4 and e5 square, is looking weak. Now black is willing to play g6 and play bishop g7, take the control of the dark squares, and it will be really tough for white to push d3 and d4 and take his own control of the center. So that is the basic planning of black, and that is the reason behind playing this kind of knight d4 move in the opening. However, Tal is not interested in wasting any tempo, so he goes for e3, knight captures knight, queen into f3, and we can see that how white's control over the center, over the dark squares of the center is really weak. So Anand goes according to the plan. He plays g6 with the idea of fianchettoing his bishop, and Tal goes for b3. He is also willing to fianchetto his own bishop because this dark square bishop of black should have some kind of healthy competition on the board. So we are looking at bishop g7 and bishop b3 by both the sides, and d6 by Anand, activating his light square bishop. Tal goes for g3 with the idea of fianchetting his other bishop by bringing it to the g2 square. Now this bishop will really be paralyzed because he needs to keep an eye on this b7 pawn. Obviously Anand does not want that, so he goes for rook b8, removing this rook from the long diagonal where there can be a potential danger. And bishop g2 by Tal. We are looking at knight h6. Now if you ask why not knight f6, I think the reason is after knight f6 this bishop will be blocked, and that will give white a chance to play knight d5 and then maybe push d4 and take the control of the dark squares, and obviously black is not playing for that. Black is playing for taking the control of the dark square. So knight h6 is really good. It fits according to the plan, because then this knight can jump on this f5 square and take the control of this d4 square, which will be really good for black. Also, white realizes that on the very next move, black is willing to play bishop g4, attacking the queen, and white will be forced to misplace his queen because there will be really small places, like very few places where the queen can be placed. So he goes for queen d1, also preparing for d4. We are looking at castles, and bishop d7, preparing to push d5. Tal prevents that by playing a4. So we are looking at bishop c6 with the idea of trading off the bishops. And then finally, because Tal was preparing for pushing this pawn, so finally he goes for d4. After bishop into g2, king into g2, we are looking at rook c8. Anand realizes that this pawn is gonna be captured really soon, and then this rook will enjoy a semi-open file, like the natural habitats of rooks. So we're looking at queen d3, cd, ed, and knight f5, putting pressure on this d pawn, also taking control of this d4 square. Black is moving exactly according to the plan. So however, d5 by Tal, and we are looking at queen b6, putting a pressure on this b pawn. White needs to protect this pawn, so he goes for knight d1. After bishop into b2, knight into b2, we are looking at e5. Now what is the reason behind playing this kind of move? Suppose here white chooses to capture this pawn through a pass, then black can capture back, and then this rook will enjoy another semi-open file, which is also be good for black. And if white does not capture this pawn, then this knight can jump to the d4 square, the square, the kind of position black was dreaming of from the very beginning. So Anand, so Tal thinks that after this knight jumps to this d4 square, it will be really annoying for white to continue. So he captures this pawn through en passant. D into e6, f into e6, and rook a d1 by white, taking a good control of this d5. Now white is really willing to push rook d1 and bring his other rook on the same file, taking a very strong control of this d file and putting a lot of pressure on this pawn on d file. So black goes for rook f6. He is planning to push e5 and defend the pawn on d file. So rook d2 by white and e5 by black. Now Tal goes for a queen d5 check, and after king g7, Tal goes for queen b5, offering a trade of the queens. But Anand's queen is looking really strong, very active on the queen side, so he is not interested in trading off queens. So he goes for queen c7, and Tal plays c5. Now the plan is that obviously if Anand captures this pawn d into c5, then rook into d7 is a fork on this king and the queen. But frankly speaking, this c5 push is not a great choice for Tal, because there is Anand has a very strong control of this c file currently. He has this queen and this rook, a proper battery on this c file, and in this position I think it is not a very good plan for Tal to push c5. So obviously Anand does not capture this pawn with his pawn, rather he goes for queen into c5, and after queen into b7 check, rook c7, we are looking at queen d5, again giving a choice to trade off the queens, and Anand goes for queen b4, putting pressure on this b pawn. And finally Tal comes up with rook fd1, taking control of this d file. So we are looking at rook c5 first, attacking this queen. Anand is planning to remove this queen from this d5 square. After removing this defender, he is willing to capture this pawn on b file. So obviously Tal needs to move his queen, and then Anand captures this pawn on b3. And here comes the critical part of the game. Let us look at some of the variations. If you think that capturing this pawn with the queen for white is good, then this is not, and this is absolutely devastating for white. Let us see how. After this point, the king is under attack, so obviously rook f7 looks a valid option. And if you think about it, then all the squares are blocked by the rooks and the queens of black. So white has only two options to move his queen. One is a8 and one is a6. Both are not possible, and both leads to massive devastation for white. Let us consider queen a8 first. Queen a8 leads to a very simple threat. Queen c2 is coming, a double attack on this rook and this knight. Suppose rook into c2, then queen into c2, and after queen d5, white is losing a piece. So obviously that cannot be an option. If white choose not to capture this rook, instead queen d5 say, then queen into d5 check, rook into d5, and knight e3 check. This pawn is pinned against the king, and here comes a family fork by the knight. And it is not only that white is going to lose a rook, rather white is going to be checkmated from this point. Anything, I mean the king is under check, right? So anything white plays, suppose king h3, then rook f into f2 is a checkmate in a few moves. This knight is defending these two squares, and rook into h2 is a checkmate that is coming soon. If white tries to defend it by rook h1, then black is gonna play rook f5. He is planning to checkmate from the other side. And suppose g4, then rook f3 check, king h4, knight g2 check, king g5, and h6 is checkmate. And instead of king h3, if he goes for something like king g1, then again rook f into f2 is deadly. White can go for rook 5 d2, but in that case black will go for rook c into d2, and rook into d2 is not possible because rook f1 is checkmate. Suppose white tries to play h3, then rook g2, king h1, rook h2 check, king g1, and rook d g2 is checkmate. So from these variations, at least we can understand that queen a8 is definitely not an option. So let us look at queen a6 in that situation. Here in this position, this queen is defending this d3 square where the knight can jump to, and now rook c2 is not that much forcing. White is gonna play knight d3, and then suppose queen d5 check, king g1, rook into d2, rook into d2. It is still winning for black, but this is not the best option for black. He has a more forcing move against white. So after queen a6, black is gonna go for knight d4. Now if you think that queen into d6, black is losing a pawn, obviously this cannot be an option, because queen b7 check is deadly. King f1 is simply losing on the very next move. Queen h1 is checkmate, so obviously not king h1. Suppose king g1, in that case black is gonna play knight f3 check, giving a fork on this king and the rook. So white is gonna lose one rook. That is also not a good option for white. So capturing this pawn is not a good option. Suppose from this position white goes for knight d3. Then queen d5 check is also a threat. After king g1, knight f3 check. Again white is losing a rook because this knight is giving a fork to the king and the rook. So all in all, this queen a6 is also not possible. We have also seen that queen a8 is not possible. So overall, we can see that queen into a7 check is not an option. White needs to accept the loss of his pawn. So Tal goes for knight d3, rook c2 by Anand anyway, and then Tal plays queen e4 trying to defend the position. Suppose Anand plays something not that good, say a6, then white can go for rook into c2, queen into c2, and then rook c1, attacking the queen and defending this whole chunk of the pieces. However, obviously Anand will not go for a6. Anand goes for rook c4, a double attack on this queen and this pawn. So Tal goes for queen d5, pinning this rook. Queen c3, breaking the pin, and then rook b2. With the idea of some double attack on this king and this pawn. Anand goes for rook b4, forking the queen and this knight, and it seems like white is gonna lose a piece, but that is not a case. White has some kind of intermezzo or intermediate move. He goes for rook b7 check, king h6, and then queen b5, defending the queen, at the same time defending the knight on d3. But the position is unfortunately absolutely lost for white in this position. Anand puts the last nail in the coffin by playing knight e3 check, forking the king and this rook. Well, if you think that white can save the day with f into e3, unfortunately that is not possible because there are mating threats after capturing this knight. Queen c2 check is completely losing for white from this position. Suppose king h3, then black is gonna go for rook h4 check, g into h4, rook f3 check, king g4, and then queen g2 is checkmate. If king g1, then queen into d1 check, king g2, and then queen f1 is checkmate. So capturing this knight is not possible. Instead, Tal goes for king g1, and instead of capturing the rook, Anand goes for queen c2, putting a pressure on this f pawn. The threat is black is gonna capture this knight, and he's gonna go for capturing this pawn. After king to h1, this queen is gonna come to the g2 square, and there is a checkmate. That is the basic threat. So white tries to defend this f pawn by playing rook f1, but then rook into d3, and white loses a piece, and at the same time there's nothing for white to do. There are checkmates coming from all the directions. Suppose white tries to do something passive, for example, say rook d7, with the idea of capturing this pawn and teasing this black king. That is not possible because queen into f2 is mate in 2, I think. Yeah, after rook into f2, rook d1 check, rook f1, and capturing this rook is checkmate. If white tries to do something active, for example queen b1, offering a trade of the queens, then rook into f2 is simply losing for white. After rook into f2, rook d1 check, queen into d1 check, rook f1, and queen into f1 is checkmate. And also f into e3 is still not an option, because obviously rook into f1 checking into f1, and rook d1 is checkmate. So I think we can understand that the game is completely losing for white, and there is nothing much for him to do. So it is in this position Mikhail Tal resigned the game, and Viswanathan Anand just went on winning the game against the legend Mikhail Tal. Now with this, we are coming to the end of the game. This game was full of tactics and positional maneuvers, and I am feeling just honored to get an opportunity to analyze this kind of game, which was played between two legends, Vishy Anand and Mikhail Tal. The same line Anand played 2 years after this game, which is c4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, and then knight d4 against Anatoly Karpov in a game in 1991, and he also won that game too. So this knight d4 move is, I think, something that you can consider if you like to play the English opening. The choice is yours as a player. If you like this move, then of course this is something to consider. However, with this, I am taking your leave. See you next time with some other exciting game of chess.